Fortunate to have a VIP among us today. We have Bailey Hack, the winner of the local 3MT competition and the People's Choice Award winner at the Western Regional Final. Okay.
There's not the shirt.
Thanks. I watched you present in Victoria, Bailey. You were very impressive. I would be very, very nervous. I don't know how you can do that. And I don't get nervous easily. Right, I'm just going to share my screen. I think we'll have a couple other people join us in the next little bit. We have like 43 people signed up, so about half of us are here. All right, why don't we get started? Thank you, everybody, for joining us this morning. The topic of today's workshop is open research practices. And I think I introduced myself a couple weeks ago to the undergraduate students, but for the graduate students on the call, my name is Chris Wright. I'm an associate dean here in the Faculty of Graduate Studies and Research. But my home department is the Department of Psychology. And I'm going to start off by telling a little story that comes out of psychology. And it's a story about how psychology has managed to destroy its own reputation as a credible social science. And it originates from this paper here. So some of you on the call will definitely know of this paper. Kale, who just popped on, will for sure know this paper. It's very famous in our discipline. And this is a really kind of interesting paper in that they claim to have demonstrated a finding that many people will maybe find kind of maybe surprising, maybe cute. And what these researchers did was they carried out a study where they presented participants with sets of words, about 5 words or so, and they were just in random order. And they asked the participants to rearrange those words so that they made a coherent thought, right? So a sentence or just something that could be understood. Now, embedded within those words, but unknown to the participants, were a few words like this: Florida, bingo, forgetful, lonely, retired, and so on. Anybody want to tell me what these words have in common? What do they make you think of? It's okay. It's a stereotype, and it's quite all right to recognize the stereotype, even if you don't agree with it. Cindy, you've
Older
got your...
individual.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Cindy. Oh, we can't hear you. It's probably your input mic is set for your computer instead of your Bluetooth. All right, Jesse got it. It's all stereotypes of old people, right? So they embedded all of these words and they asked people to rearrange these sentences. And ostensibly this was something about, how people use language or something like that. But that's not really what the study was about, because what the study was really about was how priming the old person stereotype influences people's behaviors. So the real thing that they were interested in measuring in this study was how long it took for participants to walk to the elevator after they finished the study. That was the actual dependent variable in the study. And what they found was that people who were primed with these old person stereotype words were slower to walk to the elevator than people who hadn't been exposed to these types of words. So this was, of course, a really interesting finding, and it was widely reported in literature. I don't think you can pick up a social psychology textbook that's been published since the 90s without seeing this finding in it. But the problem with it is that somewhere around 2010, 2011, 2012, researchers began to realize that it was actually really difficult to replicate this finding. So these researchers had actually done their own individual replication within the paper that they published. So they were pretty confident that it was a real finding. And they had also generalized this to other areas. So it wasn't just about older people. They had other domains in which they were priming a stereotype and then looking to see what happened when, if it influenced people's behavior. So as an example, they primed stereotypes about assertiveness and then counted how many times the participants interrupted the experimenter and things like this. So it wasn't just about the old person stereotype, but the more general principle that we can actually influence people's overt behaviors without their awareness simply by exposing them or priming the stereotype. But it didn't replicate. And this kicked off a kind of back and forth between these researchers and other researchers that were trying to replicate this finding. And then others quickly got on board and said, you know what, this isn't the only major finding in social psychology that we can't replicate. It seems like a lot of the findings that we took as kind of gospel truth aren't replicating out of social psychology. And then it kind of got bigger. It went from social psychology into psychology more generally. There wasn't just social psychology, but also clinical psychology and cognitive psychology and developmental psychology, where some of the key findings in our areas weren't replicating. They weren't easy to reproduce. And sometimes it was because, they just hadn't really identified the right conditions to be able to reproduce the finding. And that's a pretty typical thing in psychology. But it seemed to be that there was something more going on. Well, what went wrong? It seems that something about our research practices, not only in psychology, but in other areas of research, and something about the way that we get our studies published was contributing to this problem because it just became kind of more widespread and became something that was discussed in more and more areas as time went on, and eventually led to the reproducibility crisis. So the reproducibility crisis is exactly what it sounds like. Findings that we thought were just true are not replicating. We're not able to get them again under the conditions that should have elicited them, which either means we don't understand those effects very well or they're not real. Okay, and so that's a pretty earth-shattering thing in our discipline because we thought these were real effects. We thought, a lot of research programs have been built around them and have been built on trying to extend these findings and to understand them more thoroughly. But if the fundamental finding upon which they're built isn't real, then we've got a real problem. So in around the mid 2010s, researchers started to ask the question, what's contributing to this reproducibility crisis? What are the factors that lead research to be irreproducible? And here are some of the things that scientists that were surveyed, 1,500 scientists that were surveyed, cited as the reasons why the things that they thought were contributing to this reproducibility crisis. And I want to highlight a few of them on the screen here. Selective reporting is only reporting studies that work out when you've done quite a few more than that. Okay, so let's say that you've done 5 studies to try to find this priming effect, right? To try to see if people slow down when they're walking to the elevator after they're primed with old people stereotypes. But only one of them actually showed that effect. So that's the one that gets put in your paper. And the other 4, you just assume something went wrong with them and you don't ever tell anybody that you did those studies. And it's not that you're being deceptive. It's just like, who cares, right? Something probably didn't go right. I didn't do something quite right. There wasn't, the conditions weren't perfect to elicit the finding, and therefore nobody's going to be interested in this. So why would I publish it? Okay. A second factor is low statistical power. Okay. And for those of you who are in quantitative areas, you understand that in order to be able to demonstrate that an effect is real and not just the result of chance, we need to have statistical significance. But we can't get statistical significance if we don't have enough observations. So this is a huge problem in psychology because it turns out that a lot of what we thought was, real effects are based on underpowered studies that really could only produce those effects by chance alone. That's not good, right? We want to know that the effect is real and that it could be obtained under similar conditions anytime, not that it was just something that happened by chance as a fluke. A third factor that was identified is that when we tried to go back and actually redo these studies, a lot of times the things that we need to redo them aren't available to us. So sometimes it's because the methods aren't described in sufficient detail in the method section of the researcher's papers. Sometimes it's because the code that's used to produce the output isn't available, or produce some other aspect of the research design just isn't available for others to obtain and modify and to work with. And so they don't actually know how they could get the results that the original researchers got because they don't quite know what they did to get them. A fourth factor is that the raw data aren't available for being able to do a person for a person to be able to pick up and do their own reanalysis, right? So if I think that there's something, when I'm reading a paper, I think like, I don't know how you got that finding, like that doesn't make sense to me. I should have the opportunity to be able to try it myself, right? Like, let me have the data, let me analyze it, let me see if I can get the same thing you do. But until recently, that wasn't commonly done. And if I wanted it, I had to reach out to other researchers and ask them to share their data. And some were kind of stingy, or maybe they had other reasons for not wanting to share it. They were afraid that it was going to get stolen and used for, purposes that they didn't agree to, or whatever else. So it just isn't the case that raw data is always available. And sometimes it's just simply lost. As time goes on, people move, they move their lab, or they move to a new institution, and things just get lost. And there's no way to recover that original data in some instances. The final is one that we don't like to think about too much, but is one that we do have to consider, and that's that the results are just flat out fraud. I do not want to imply that the finding that I talked about previously, the one that I'm using in my example, is the result of fraud. I think that the researchers really do believe that this is a real and replicable finding. They had a good theory for why that finding should be observed. And when they tested that theory and they found that it was supported by the evidence that they had, they got excited like any researcher would. I don't want to impugn the researchers that did this work and suggest that maybe the reason why it doesn't replicate is because it was fraudulent in the first place. But what I want to suggest is that this is an explanation for why some findings don't reproduce. Okay, and that's one that we have to consider, is that they're just made up. And we know in social psychology, but in other areas as well, that there are bad actors. There are people who engage, there are researchers who engage in fraud. And so, that you can find examples quite easily through a Google search if you wish, but it's unfortunately more common than we'd like to believe. And the consequences for the individuals who engage in the fraud, but also the individuals associated with them, can be quite severe. Okay, I highlighted those ones because these are all things that can be addressed by open research. And this was kind of the impetus for the open research movement. So what is open research? We're going to talk about not only what it is, but why we should want to do research in an open way. We'll talk about what we mean by open materials, open data, open access to research findings, the distinction between pre-registration and registered reports, so pre-registration of research hypotheses and registered reports. We'll talk about using the open science framework, which despite its name is useful for more than just scientists. I want to talk about transparency statements in the age of generative AI. It's something that I've added to this presentation as time has gone on. And if we have time, I want to end, I'm hoping to have time for a discussion on ethical issues in open research practices. So in a nutshell, open research just means carrying out research in a transparent manner. Let others see what it is that you're doing. This can take a lot of forms. So probably the first thing that people who know about open research practices think about is making research materials and data and research articles readily available to others. But it can also mean archiving your data in a way that actually allows others to reuse it. And we may not give a lot of thought to that, right? So like I said, I come from psychology. This is my kind of frame of reference, but we often collect data using surveys. In the old days, we used to do it all paper-based, right? A paper-based survey might be readily understandable to me as the person who created the survey or whatever measure I'm using. But as soon as 15 years go by and I go back to that and another researcher is asked to see that data and I hand it over, they might not be able to make heads or tails of my survey. And it might be because, the way that I've coded the information, the results, is only known to me and wouldn't be readily understandable to another researcher. So open research practices encourage us to archive our data in ways that allow us to actually allow other people to make use of it. For those who use script-based analysis software for data analysis, things like R or even the syntax and SPSS and so on, providing those scripts so that others can carry out those data analyses for themselves and see exactly step by step what assumptions you made and exactly how you proceeded with your data analysis. Okay, if you provide the computer code, right, the script that allows people to rerun those analyses or to make changes so that they can run their analysis to be as similar as yours. That ensures that they have the best chance of being able to reproduce your finding. Another aspect of open research practices is registering our hypotheses in advance of collecting the data. And we don't just sort of file this away somewhere on our computer and say, okay, yeah, I wrote down what my hypotheses are, and I'm going to go back and pull that out now. We do this publicly, right? So we put this somewhere so that it's publicly available and others can see that, yeah, on February 15th, Chris said that this is what should happen if he carries out this experiment. And on May 25th, he collected the data and found that he has support for those hypotheses, right? That's important. That sequencing is important because it suggests that if I actually get data that are consistent with that hypothesis, well, I had predicted that hypothesis, or I had generated that hypothesis from a theory and made predictions about how the data should look. And then those predictions were confirmed. That's a very different thing than collecting a whole bunch of data and poking around to see if I can find effects, okay, which is a surefire recipe for contributing to the reproducibility problem that we talked about previously. And finally, carrying out and reporting statistical power calculations is also a very important piece of this, because as we said previously, one of the things that is challenging in some of these studies is that the sample sizes are so small that the results should never have been obtained in the first place. In that study that I mentioned previously about the elderly stereotypes, there were 29 participants in each of the two experiments. Now, it was good that they replicated it with a second sample, but that's a very small sample for what we now know, if it's a real effect at all, is a very small effect. And we know that small effects require big samples to be able to detect, okay? And that the chances of getting a significant result that's spurious, right, that happens just by chance are really high when a study is underpowered. Angel has her hand up. Hello, Angel.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Can you hear me?
We can.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. O. I'm so sorry I came on about 10 minutes late. My question, so I'm not even sure if we're supposed to hold our questions till the end, so thanks for taking me. My question is on the second last bullet point here about publicly committing, our predictions and that kind of thing, which, in theory is, as I understand, to protect from tweaking things later to fit something that we were actually thinking the whole time, like you embark on research and you already know what the answer has to be, that kind of thing. But my question is, where would you suggest publishing this publicly slash how?
I'm so glad you asked, Angel. We're actually going to talk about something called the Open Science Framework, which is the perfect place to do this. There are others like it, other things that, I think there's something called oh, I'm not going to get the name right now. Maybe somebody else on the call knows, but there's other variants of that kind of same platform that allows people to do that. Oh, Predict It, which is a great name, right? Predict It. And it's the same idea that that's where you would record your predictions and they would get time stamped. And there's kind of templates that we can use to do that and other ways that we can do that. But I will talk about OSF, so I'm glad you asked. Okay, so the main underlying principle behind open research is to have accountability to the public. We want to make sure that the research that we're doing, which is often publicly funded, can withstand scrutiny, right? That if others look at it, they would agree that it was done in a defensible way, that it was done according to the standards of our discipline. But we also, in doing so, we have accountability to other researchers as well. So, as I mentioned previously, one of the big problems with putting out a finding in literature that isn't real is that other people chase it, right? Other people try to replicate it, they try to expand on it, they try to understand it, they build research programs around understanding that exciting finding that was published in literature, but it may not be real, and therefore it may not be worth anybody's time or putting resources into trying to understand better. So, in that way, we make sure that other researchers can look and see what we did and say, yeah, that meets the standards for the discipline. Like if there's a finding here that doesn't replicate, it's not because of anything that was done that was nefarious or that was done poorly. Or maybe it is, right? Maybe it is the case that the research wasn't done well, and then others will be able to see that. Okay, that maybe there's something about the design or about the analysis that led to the spurious result, and then other researchers will be able to see that. So it just builds in a kind of a community of accountability when we do our research in an open way. And I would argue accountability to ourselves. I know that if I'm doing something and others are going to be seeing it, I work harder on it, right? I don't take shortcuts if I know that somebody else could find out that I took a shortcut, right? I do things in a way that's defensible and that can withstand scrutiny if I know that that scrutiny is coming or could come in the future. So in a way, being able to do things in an open way also builds in some accountability to ourselves. It also promotes collaboration across research groups by giving us the ability to access one another's materials and data. And it just makes it easier to collaborate because of that, right? There's all these kind of side benefits from doing things in an open way. Besides the kind of honesty and ethics piece, there's the practical piece as well. That if I'm collaborating with people in another part of the country or in another country altogether, it makes it a lot easier for us to do that if we have all of the information that we need for the research collaboration in one place. This is one of my main motivations for doing research, for using open research practices. And it's so that I can be sure that if somebody asks me for my data in a few years from now, which is always a scary prospect, that I can actually find it. And not only can I find it, but I can make sense of it and provide them the data in a way that they can make use of. And this is critical. One of the things that always worried me before I got kind of sold on open research practices was, what if somebody asks me for my data and, I can locate the original files and whatever else, but I just can't remember how things were coded. And so what I hand them is just kind of a mess of numbers and, columns in a spreadsheet with all kinds of numbers and say, I think this was that. And I'm pretty sure the relevant column for carrying out this analysis is AH. And, but I just, I can't be entirely sure. And then they can't reproduce my results. And then they accuse me of fraud. Right. So these are all like, kind of, anxieties that probably are not well founded in reality, but they're things to worry about. Right. And so for me, a motivating force was, if I am organized and doing things in an open way right from the get-go, I don't have to worry about if somebody asks me down the road for my data. I'll already have it in an organized way, and I will have things done in a way that makes it usable for others, because that's part of this. It allows me to have a public repository of my materials, which then makes them available to absolutely everybody, but also me. And it also allows for systematic archiving of things. When I need my data, I know where to go for it now. I go to OSF. I don't bother digging through my computer trying to pull up these old data files, or worse, having to find my collaborators, my former graduate students, track them down wherever they are and say, hey, remember we did that project in 2016? Yeah, do you happen to have the data from that project we did 9 years ago together? Do you remember that we did a project together 9 years? Okay, good. Yes. Okay. Do you have the data? No. Okay. So this ensures that that data is just always available, right? If I do things right from the get-go. So with my students, they understand right from the hop that they need to get an OSF account and that they need to start archiving materials and data and making sure that it's all accessible to not just others, but to future me and future them. And as another side benefit of this, because these databases like OSF and so on are searchable, and because we're encouraged to put copies of our papers into places where they can be freely accessed with no cost by others, and we'll talk about that momentarily, it facilitates dissemination of my research. That's one less barrier to people accessing my research, right? They don't have to pay to access it. The article will be freely available. Or if I have my project on OSF, other users of OSF or people who just know how to use OSF can search for projects that meet their criteria and perhaps find mine, right? And so maybe, besides getting my research out there more, maybe, maybe I can pick up other collaborators, right? People will say, hey, I came across your project in OSF. I'm doing something really similar. And I think, maybe we should talk and get involved. So it's kind of like, being at a conference without having to go, leave your office or your seat. So why should we do this? Besides all the reasons that I've outlined for what it is, which kind of blends in with why we do it, we kind of have to now. So for most funders, they have some requirement to make materials available to others. Certainly the big agencies that fund research in Canada, the Tri-Agency in particular, now have pretty strict requirements for making information available to others. So since about 2008 for CIHR and 2015 for the other two, that's the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council and the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, they require that the articles that result from publicly funded, from research funded from grants from those agencies be made freely available to the public and to other researchers. Okay, that is right at odds with what journal publishers want, right? Journal publishers want to be able to charge for articles because if they can charge for articles, they make money. You don't make any money as the author, but they do as the publisher, right? And so this has been an ongoing challenge, both for the publishing industry, which seems to be weathering it just fine, and for researchers. The compromise that has been reached is that journals themselves will make research articles freely available if the researcher pays for that. Okay, so if the researcher is willing to cough up $1,800, $3,200, whatever it is, dollars, they will open it up. So when that article shows up in their list of articles on their journal's website, it'll have a little lock beside it, and that lock will be unlocked because somebody has paid the open access fee to make that available to others. Okay, so that's one way to achieve this. Another way to achieve this, maybe just before I jump to that, another way to achieve this is through using repositories that we'll talk about momentarily. And the U of R has a repository for this express purpose to allow us to make articles available to other researchers for free. Researchers are, since 2023, the research Tri-Agency has also required universities to come up with a research data management strategy. So that's relatively new, right? That's just 2 years ago that they were charged with this, and universities rather were given a deadline for complying with this. And what they're required to do is ensure that researchers working at their institutions have an option for locally archiving their data with the university in a way that makes it publicly available to others who have a legitimate reason to want to access that research data. Okay, there is an exception, and it's an important one. It's for research that is collected by Indigenous people or in partnership with Indigenous peoples. Indigenous research property is the property of the Indigenous people who rightfully own that data or that knowledge, and so the ownership will always reside with them, and this doesn't supersede that. Okay, so for those who carry out research with or for Indigenous communities, that's an important thing to keep in mind, is that the data is owned by the Indigenous community, and that we can't archive that data in our archive without consulting with the community, seeking the permission of the community, and ensuring that the community has ongoing access themselves and can withdraw that at any time, no matter what mechanism we use to archive our data or their data. Okay, so thanks to the advent of the internet and digital computing more generally, in a lot of areas, it's been possible to make research materials available digitally. Obviously, this is not true if you're a chemist, or at least not all of your materials can be available that way. We can't make a chemical reagent available on the internet. But for many things like questionnaires or stimuli or vignettes or whatever other types of photographs, any other types of materials that might be able to be used by others in research, they can be digitized and therefore they can be shared. So computer code, audio recordings, video recordings, images, scans of documents and books, different types of training sets for people who do machine learning type research, manuals for different procedures for how to use equipment and for carrying out actual research studies. And if it's something that's highly technical that requires a lot of care and precision, and just anything that can be shared digitally can be shared in this way. And what's nice about sharing these types of materials is that it reduces the possibility of error and replication, and it allows other researchers to go in and say, you know, I'm looking at what you used here, and I actually don't think that's the best questionnaire for answering that question. Or I don't think that your code is correct, right? That the code that you used to analyze that data, I don't think is appropriate for analyzing that data or whatever else. And of course, if I've already done it, if I've already created a stimulus set or put together a questionnaire or documented a procedure that others are going to want to carry out in a manual, well, that work's done. It probably costs some money. There's no sense in you doing the same thing, both of us, right? So it reduces it just increases the efficiency and it makes better use of those materials. Okay, so I had mentioned previously that my fear was always that, you know, somebody would actually ask me for my data. And it did happen a few times over the years. And it was always a mad scramble to try to figure out, you know, how I'm going to code this in a way that makes sense to others and so on. So I don't worry about those things anymore, thanks to OSF. But it was always the case that I had to share my data if I was asked to do so. That's an ethical obligation. It was not always the case that people would agree to it. So one of the nice things about the open research movement is that there's been a much greater pressure on researchers to share data. Certainly, as I mentioned previously, the tri-agency requires it, except in a limited set of circumstances. But just more generally, research communities expect it. So if there's a confidentiality agreement or a patent or something, obviously that's going to lead to an exception as well. But generally speaking, most of us are not doing that kind of research. And for those of us who aren't, there's not a great reason to not share our results or our materials, our data or our materials. And we should be open to this. We should be open to the scrutiny. We should welcome others to do reanalyses of our data. We should not fear it. We should not worry that they're not going to get the same outcome that we got, right? We should invite that. It's scrutiny. And as long as, you know, we didn't outright fabricate our data or falsify it or do anything else shady, right? If an error is discovered, that's a good thing, right? That's a good thing. And we can take steps to correct that. But we shouldn't worry about that happening or what's going to happen to our reputation if someone finds an error. Mistakes are common. And mistakes likely account for a good part of the reproducibility crisis. And the more we can get on top of those and get them out of the literature, the less worry we have about findings getting published that are not reproducible or others wasting their time trying to replicate them. And of course, if the data has already been collected and that data can be shared, then there's no reason for you to collect your own data set. You can use mine. Maybe you can reanalyze the data in a completely different way than I did and lead to new discoveries or find new things as a result of that. Okay, and when I say analyze data, I do mean also qualitative data. It is possible to share qualitative data. Some precautions have to be put in place to do so, right? We have to be very careful about ensuring that the data are anonymized, that the data are, that we have permission from the original participants to reuse the data. So that has to be collected at the time that we collect the data initially, because after the participant leaves our study, it may not be possible to contact them again and ask them if it's okay to share their data with other researchers. So we need to get that permission in advance. And that's now a standard part of the Research Ethics Board application. You have to have a plan for if you're planning to share your data, how you're going to get that permission to do so. But these things can be managed, and then that data can be put to good use, maybe better uses than it was planned for originally by the people who collected it. Okay, I mentioned that the U of R has resources to help researchers to meet these obligations. It's the library's responsibility to help researchers in this regard and to give researchers options for being able to meet their obligations and for managing the university's data management strategy and so on. So what the U of R has provided is the option to share data through the Borealis Dataverse, or something if you have a really large data set through something called the Federated Research Data Repository. I was going to click over to show you what the Borealis Dataverse looks like, but just in the interest of time, I think I'll just describe it. So essentially, if you go on there, what you'll find from the U of R's little corner of the Borealis Dataverse is a whole bunch of data sets that have been archived by University of Regina researchers. And so it's just one place that they can share it. Of course, they could also share it using the Open Science Framework, which is what we do in my lab, or other similar sharing things. But this is how the university meets its obligation, because the university is required to provide, as part of its data management strategy, an option for researchers to locally house their data, to have it stored right here in Regina. Okay. Researchers can use any data management strategy they wish, as long as it's consistent with what are called the FAIR principles, and that's that the data are findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. I'm just going to go through those real quick. If it's findable, it means that the data has metadata, right? So these are things like keywords and dates and authors and publishers if the data are published and so on, anything that can be used to help somebody understand what data it is that they're getting and to actually find that data, right? So that information needs to be contained in the metadata that accompanies the actual data. It needs to be accessible. So ideally, freely accessible, that anybody who stumbles upon it can now retrieve the data itself. They can download that data set and use it for their own purposes. Okay, but if not, then instructions on how it can become so. Usually this is something like an email to the owner of the data to say, hey, I'm interested in this data set. You know, here's what I want to use it for. Can you release it to me, right? Can you make it available to me? But that's part of this, is making sure that people, once they find it, they also have instructions on how to get it. Okay, interoperable means that it's data that's stored in a language that can interface with other data sets. So this is going to become more of an issue in things like computer science, where you can program in a lot of different languages. But you want to make it clear what language this data is in, so that it can be used by people and used in conjunction with other data sets. And if there's not common language there, then it can't be integrated. And reusable, it needs to be clear what conditions led to the generation of this data in the first place, so that somebody can decide whether it's suitable for their purposes, right? So if I stumble on a data set, but I don't know where that data came from, I don't know under what conditions that data were collected, I might not be able to do anything with it, because I don't know if it works for my purposes, right? So we need to make sure that once people find it, they can make that determination. There's enough information stored alongside that allows for that determination. You talked about open access. And I mentioned previously that one way to achieve that is by paying the journal to make your article open access. But another way to do that journals have agreed to is to allow researchers who have published in their journal, or who are about to publish in their journal, to take the final accepted copy of the manuscript, so the one that all the reviewers and the editor agree is publishable, and take that version of it and archive that version of it. Okay, so that's going to look a lot like a draft, right? But it's a polished draft that has gone through peer review, that has had all the corrections made and so on. It's not going to look like a beautifully formatted journal article like we're used to seeing. It's going to look like your typical paper that you hand in to one of your classes, APA format at the title page and so on, but it's the same information, right? It's the same information. It has the same introduction methods and so on, right? Whatever it is that is contained in that article, it's maybe not as pretty as the version that will eventually appear in the publication, but it's all the same information. Okay, and that's what we're allowed to archive. And here at the U of R, we have the OurSpace digital repository managed by our library that allows us to archive that version of manuscripts, so that we can meet our obligation to make those manuscripts freely available, to make our articles freely available to others. If you do a master's or PhD thesis, that will happen not quite automatically. You have to grant permission for it, but we're going to ask you for permission to archive your master's thesis and your PhD thesis in the library here in the Our Space repository, but also in the National Library of Canada. And some departments, like my own home department, psychology, also archive honors theses. So you may be asked to do that if you complete an honors thesis. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about the distinction between pre-registration of a hypothesis and registered reports. One of the key things that we know has contributed to the reproducibility crisis is what we call p-hacking. P-hacking, for those who have background statistics, you'll know that P is the probability that this result occurred just by chance alone. And the magic number in most social science research, and probably most research more broadly, is that there's not more than a 1 in 20 chance that these data occurred by chance alone. So 0.05 is the magic number. And what we sometimes in the past would see researchers doing is just selectively reporting those results that met that threshold. So in other words, that were statistically significant, or that were carrying out their analyses in a way using filtering of participants and so on, and doing things that would increase the likelihood that a result would obtain just by chance, right? So in other words, that they would get a significant result, which could just be spurious, right? If you have to kind of work to get a significant result, is that finding really real? Is it really there? Okay. So, oh, I have a question in the chat. Who can we ask to archive our master's or PhD work? You'll be asked. So if you're defending a master's thesis or a PhD thesis as part of that, part of the paperwork that you do at that time, you'll be asked to give permission at that time. And Angèle, please.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that based on my own experience. So when I did my master's, it was at the U of R and I finished in 2022. And so up came whatever, I forget if it was a form or through an email, whatever. I'm like asked permission. I don't even think it was framed that way. And anyways, my answer was no. I just had my reasons. And I said, no, I don't want you to publish this anywhere, actually. No. And I was told, I forget how it was framed, but it was basically, you have to. Like, I forget if it was like, okay, you can say no, but then you won't graduate. Or like, there was something that you just could not turn down, right? Like, I was really over a barrel. And it was explained to me that, well, like some legitimate reasons would be if it risks the advancement of the project in the future, and there was all these scholarly reasons. And my reasons had nothing to do with that. And so I was really over a barrel. Like, so we're not really asked permission, or at least that wasn't my experience.
Yeah, it's a little bit like you don't have to get the vaccine, but you won't be working here anymore, right? It's the same kind of thing. You don't have to agree to this, but we won't be conferring a degree on you if you don't. I agree. There's some question about that. That is because we have an obligation to the public to share the research that we do. And so I think that as an alternative to sharing it in the library, there would have to be some other acceptable way of permanently sharing it. So it couldn't be just on an individual's website or something like that. It would have to be through a repository of some other repository, maybe not ours, but some other repository as an acceptable alternative to that. But it's a good point. It's not really truly voluntary in that sense, since it's a part of our requirements for graduation, at least at this university. Going back to p-hacking, one of the remedies for p-hacking is to specify in advance what you thought you were going to find, so that if you do find that thing, you're only confirming what you already thought you were going to find and not fishing. Okay, so the alternative to that is to carry out a bunch of analyses, and whatever comes out significant, that was what you were really interested in. That's what you're going to report on now. Okay, so it's much less likely that a result is spurious if it was predicted, right? If you had a good theory and you had a good idea about how the results should come out, and then they come out in exactly that way, that's really good evidence that your theory is supported by the data that you've got. Okay, if you had a theory and it predicted that it should come out one way, but it actually some other interesting finding came out instead, and it was totally counter to what you wanted to or expected to find, that could be really interesting, but that's a reason to replicate, right? Let's see if we can get that interesting finding again, and maybe one more time after that, to make sure that it's not just spurious, because it wasn't predicted, and the chances of getting spurious significant findings are much greater when they weren't predicted in advance. Okay, pre-registration helps because it allows us to timestamp when we actually came up with that hypothesis and compare that to when the data were collected. Okay, so that we can't really go back on ourselves, right? That if we later say, well, actually, my hypothesis was this, you can say, no, I can go back and look to see what it really was at that point in time. All right. So we contrast that with a registered report. Pre-registration is just locking down your hypothesis somewhere, whereas a registered report is an actual completely different way of publishing our findings. So the kind of traditional way or the standard way of doing this has always been in the past to write an introduction, write your method section, carry out data collection, carry out the analysis of the data, and then write up your discussion based on the conclusions that what have you learned from this investigation? And then you submit it for publication. This is a different approach. And it's one that prioritizes transparency because it doesn't incentivize bad behavior. The idea here is that you'll only write the introduction and methods and present a plan for how you want to collect and analyze the data. So what data are you going to collect and how do you plan to analyze it? And then it's that you submit to the peer review process. So that's what undergoes peer review. And if you're eventually able to get the reviewers to agree that your plan is good and the editor agrees as well, usually this requires quite a few rounds of back and forth because they want to make sure they got it right. The payoff is that you begin your data collection after you have the approval or the agreement of the journal to publish the article. So no matter how the data turn out, as long as you've stuck to the plan that you indicated in that previous submission that went through the peer review process and was agreed to by the editor, you will have a publication, right? So it seems like a pretty good deal. And the upside here is that, or the reason why we like these types of things is because they take away the incentive to do things like p-hacking or to do things in a way that will engineer a particular outcome, right? Now, no matter how the data turn out, you had everybody on board with what you were planning to do and how you were planning to do it. And now the data are what the data are. Okay. And if they didn't come out the way that you predicted, that's okay. You still have an interesting story to tell, and it will still be published by the journal. Okay. What's interesting, just as a side note to this, is that this hasn't really been picked up by researchers. Researchers still prefer to do things the typical way, the traditional way. And I think part of that is because researchers want to be sure they've got something worth publishing. Even though they could be guaranteed a publication under this route, there's a lot of time and effort that goes into making the plan perfect and getting it by the reviewers and getting the editor to go along with it before the data collection begins. And researchers just kind of want to get on with data collection and see if there's something cool happening here that's worth pursuing further. So there's a little bit of a human element to this that even though it seems like a great idea on paper, it hasn't really been taken up very, very much. All right, I had promised to talk about the Open Science Framework, which is a repository or a resource, maybe it's better to say, available on the web that allows for researchers to permanently archive data, research materials, all kinds of things, including even the rough or the final approved copy of their article if they so wish to share it that way. And it's funded by the Open Science Foundation, which is a not-for-profit organization, and so reliant on government funding and donations and things of that sort. But it promises to make these materials available until, they may have updated this, I haven't looked recently, but until at least 2050. Okay, so they have enough money in place right now that they know for sure that they'll be able to make this commitment, that everything will be available freely to others until at least 2050, and should, of course, the hope is that it will continue on beyond that. Angel, I think you have your hand up. I can't quite see.
Yep.
Popped
Oh
off my
yeah,
screen.
my background makes it fade out, doesn't it? I need a hot pink one or something. Um, my question is about these journals or editors who agree to do this pre-registration thing you described. Like, is this only certain, excuse me, journals or disciplines or something?
Yes. So you would be looking for a journal that specifically advertises that it offers registered reports. I don't think every journal has gotten on board with that, but many have. And the one I'm most familiar with is the Canadian Journal of Experimental Psychology, because that's my own area, and that's why I know that it hasn't been well taken up, because they've tried to find ways to incentivize people to do it. But it's an option that they made available about 5 years ago, and other journals around that time were making the option available as well. So whether they continue to make that option available going forward, I don't know. But that's yeah, you want to check the journal to see if it has that as an option. In the same way that sometimes journals will accept review papers in lieu of papers that present new empirical findings or meta-analyses or that kind of thing. So just another option. Yeah, good
Right.
question.
And the word that we're looking for is registration.
Registered reports.
Registered report.
Yeah,
Thank you.
registered reports would be the key. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. All right. So what's really nice about OSF is, besides the fact that it's a permanent repository and it gives you a URL that you can publish in your paper so that people can always find the materials or supplementary analyses or code or data in one place, it also lets you take some things out of the article and put them in a place where others can find them always. Right. So the idea here is the permanence, right? That this will be publicly and permanently available for free. It doesn't matter. Journals can come and go, right? A journal can fold if it's not financially viable, but OSF should always be there for us. In theory, if governments continue to support it, who knows? This is a topic for another day, I suppose. But luckily, this originates out of Europe and not out of the US. So the support for it should continue to be there for some time. All right. Ever heard of Chat GPT? Anyone? No?
Boo!
AI is your friend, Angel. Yeah, we know about it, ChatGPT and AI, right? I want to talk a little bit about the importance of transparency in the use of AI. Right now, it is usually the case for most, if you apply for a scholarship or if you submit a grant application, that there are guidelines around the use of AI in the preparation of that scholarship application or that grant application. It's the same thing with submitting an article to a journal. You can use AI, but there are guidelines around how you're allowed to use AI, what you're allowed to do, and how you disclose that use. So there are many different forms that AI applications take. ChatGPT, of course, is the most famous of them, but even Grammarly is powered by AI. Google Translate is powered by AI. That stupid Google summary that you see now every time you Google something is powered by AI.
Which you can disable by typing -AI in your search terms.
Or including a curse word, I've heard, will also make it so it doesn't appear.
I read about that too, yeah, on Reddit.
But in any case, the important thing is to be able to explain to others what tools you have used and how you have used them. So I really want to emphasize that as students, before you use any AI tool in your research, or especially in the writing of your research articles or theses or coursework, that you have to get your instructor or supervisor's permission to do so. In research context, that'd be your research supervisor, but you need permission to do that. Different instructors have different policies on the use of AI. There's no university-wide policy, except that the instructor gets the final say. Okay, for theses, it's the supervisor and the committee get the final say for master's and PhD theses about whether you can use AI and how you do so. Okay. If you're collaborating with others, you absolutely have to let them know also that you are using AI and that you're using AI tools, even something like Grammarly. This is really important because if the work gets flagged as having been written by AI and that's in contravention with a journal's policy, or even with like you heard Angel boo ChatGPT at the beginning of this, right? Like, she may not want to be involved in a collaboration where AI was used to do part of the writing on that paper. And that's a discussion that you need to allow her to have, but she can't have that with you. She doesn't know that you've done that. Okay, so if you're allowed to use the tool, you have to clarify in a transparency statement how the tool is used. This is now mandatory for master's and PhD theses, but I would encourage you to do it for all of your work. I would encourage you to do it for any work you submit for a course or anywhere else. If you're using these tools after having been given permission to do so, come up with a transparency statement. You need to give the names of all the tools that you were using, including any writing assistance tools, even things that you think are not AI, right? Like, people don't think of Grammarly as AI. It is. It now has the capability of generating text. It certainly has the capability to rewrite your text. It's powered by AI. It's important that you mention that. Okay, Quillbot can completely turn you into another person, right? Turn your writing into as if it was written by somebody with a degree far more advanced in a different field than you hold currently, right? So you want to be very clear if you're using these applications. For each tool, you want to explain not only what the name of the tool is, but how it was used. Okay. And there are a lot of things you can do with AI tools now, and we will be doing in the future. This will eventually become commonplace. It'll become standard in the future, right? But we're at the cusp of it right now. We're transitioning into, a lot of us are getting used to this and learning how to live with it. But there's so many things that these AI tools are able to do. And if you do any of them, you want to acknowledge that. Okay, so here's a sample transparency statement. This is somebody who loves AI. I just made it up, but you can well imagine. Deep AI was used to generate article summaries from which literature review was derived. Additional content was generated by ChatGPT. ChatGPT was also used to identify areas for improvement in the manuscript. Quillbot was used to improve the grammar and syntactic structure of the writing. And finally, DAL-E was used to generate figure 1. Okay, so you get the idea. This is obviously extreme. This person's using AI at pretty much every stage of the preparation of their manuscript. And you wouldn't do any of it if you didn't have permission and the blessing of both your supervisor and any co-authors on your work. You want to make sure everybody's on board, everybody understands what we're doing here, and that it's clear how AI has been used to anyone reading the paper. Okay, it's, as I've already mentioned, it's really imperative that others know what content, if any, was generated by AI. So you need to make that clear in whichever way you do it. You also don't want to cite AI applications as the source of information. They're not a primary source of information. That would be like citing Google. Okay, when you find a book online that you use to help you prepare your thesis, right? You wouldn't cite Google, you cite the book that Google retrieved for you, right? Well, it's the same thing with ChatGPT. We shouldn't be citing ChatGPT or any other AI application that finds information for you, but it can be a good way to identify sources of information, and then you want to go back and check to make sure that that information is actually correct. AI applications lie. They hallucinate, they confabulate, they make stuff up. So you want to be very careful to not take AI as a definitive source of any information. Angel, jump in, tell us about AI.
Hey, can I add to two things? And I could go on forever, but I won't. I just want to add two very important facts that I recently found out when I was grading papers. One is that if you used, in this case, it was ChatGPT. I don't know if things like Blackbox do the same thing, but if you used ChatGPT to find a source on the internet, in this case, it was an ontario.ca website, slash whatever, slash, slash, slash. When you click on that ontario.ca, whatever source found from ChatGPT and go there, the URL is going to add at the end slash source equals ChatGPT. So and apparently many websites are starting to do this just to trace the origin of the traffic. And so my point is, don't put in your bibliography, this is what I saw with my own eyes, a URL which was all legit, and when I click on it, it goes there, but I can tell that that person found it using ChatGPT, which in this case was not allowed. The other thing I want to say is just affirm you, Dr. O, in saying that generative AI hallucinates. I found many, many, many sources in these bibliographies that just don't exist. They look like they exist. And then when you start asking Reddit, like everyone else is saying, oh yeah, it looks legit. Like I recognize the author and I recognize the journal name and it sounds like this could be a legitimate title of an article, but it just doesn't exist. AI hallucinates. So I mean, obviously, don't be using it in the first place, is my opinion, but I understand not everyone shares my opinion. So if you're going to do it, be smart about it and don't just, take its word for it.
That's very sage advice. We're at time. We're at 11 o'clock. I'm happy to stay on. I would love to continue to discuss some ethical issues. I'm very curious about what you think about open research practices. Do you think they actually achieve the goal that they're intended to achieve? Do they help to reduce these ethical issues that we've identified? And are there any ethical issues that are made worse by open research practices? Anybody that has to go, please do. I don't want to keep you past the time, but for those of you who want to stay, by all means, hop on the mic if you wish to contribute. What do you think? Anything that's made worse from an ethical standpoint? Any new problems that we have created through open research practices?
I just think about like if you're doing qualitative study, I think the whole confidentiality piece could potentially be made worse sometimes. So I think you'd have to be just really careful around like what is being shared and ensuring that it's you know, completely anonymous.
I was hoping you'd say that. I see that as the biggest challenge too. I think it's one thing to leave out names and other clearly identifying information like that from the data. I mean, that's sort of common sense, right? We wouldn't keep that with the data in any case, not for publicly archiving it. But it's also in the context of the article that goes along with that data, it may be possible for people to triangulate about who's actually participating in the study, right? That in itself is an ethical issue, but it becomes more of an issue depending on what other researchers choose to do going forward, right? So there may be quotations that the first researcher decided to withhold because they thought, ooh, that's going to be inflammatory. Like if anybody figures out what community this is, where this data was collected and with whom, that quotation is really going to cause problems for the real people from whom these data were collected, right? Well, that's something that the next researcher might not be aware of, right? They may not have enough as the person who didn't, they didn't collect the data themselves, so they may not have been fully aware of the context, and now they're sharing quotations that seem to them to be pretty benign, that are actually quite inflammatory if they'd known the original context. So I agree with you, Bailey, completely. Like I would worry about that. Kaylee was in my ethics class this past winter, and we actually had an article about the ethical sharing and reuse of qualitative data. And the author of that article argued very forcefully that this is something that can be done, and that most concerns are overblown of that regard. I can't say I agree with her, to be honest. She's probably way smarter than me and knows much more about qualitative research, certainly, than I do. But it just seems to me on the surface of it that it's a very, once you let that genie out of the bottle, there's no way to control it, right? So I've put all the data out there. Now, I will say that her recommendation was that researchers have to make sort of an application to access that kind of data. So it wouldn't simply be posted on the web for anybody to Google and find, right? But that rather you'd have to contact the researcher, explain what you want to use the data for. That gives the researcher an opportunity to say, hey, here's some more context that didn't make it into my paper, but I want you to be aware of as you're going through and looking at these data. So at least there's that opportunity to intervene. And at least for as long as the researcher is active as a researcher and alive, right? Like eventually that data will be old enough that the person may not be available anymore to provide that context. But yeah, lots of messiness there. So good one. I agree with you 100%. Other issues?
This might not be like as big of an issue as the last one, but I'm just thinking it might turn like new researchers or like baby researchers off of doing research if they publish their materials and like do everything correctly, and then they get a lot of negative feedback from others. But
Yeah.
if the negative feedback is deserved, like I don't know how you kind of like go about that, but I can just see people being mean about things to researchers, and then having those researchers not want to do research anymore.
That's a really good point. I hadn't really thought about that. But I think there's something there, right? Because now anybody is free to send an email to tell you what they think about, what you did. And they could even post it on a blog or something, right? Like publicly. I mean, that would be a pretty unethical thing to do, to name the researcher, name and shame the researcher they think is doing things in a way that they disagree with. But there's nothing, it promotes that, right? In a way that we had a little bit of protection around the peer review process, right? Because it was really bad, it's just not going to get published. And the only people, you can even go through that process blind, right? You could submit your manuscript without identifying who you are as the author. And if it's terrible, no one will ever know except the editor who was involved, right? So at least it keeps the number of people that are aware small. Whereas that's going to get really quite big if somebody decides to post something about, what a terrible researcher Chris Oriot is on their blog, and there can be a massive pile-on. And you're right, like, I'm a human being. After a while, I might be very discouraged by that, even as a more experienced researcher.